All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Share to thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilson Mishpacha of Eretz Yisrael, dedicating all of the Shem and Joshua's this year as a zchus from Besoros Tovos Sha'am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Haba Alim Latova Ben Goldberg, for the Shema of his parents, Avram Ben Asher Pinchas, Fegar Ezel, Bas Zelig, and in the hopes that all the tefillos of our precious kilo are answered during this month and in the months ahead. Shmuli and Liba Dinovitz, the Ilui Nishmas, Rabbi Ari Flum, Harav Yitzchak, Aryeh Ben Achavar, Rabbi Yaakov, Zichron Lebracha. And a week of learning sponsored David Goodman, Le'ilui Nishmas, Roy Ben Aryeh. Well, say with that, let us begin. And of course, as always in the schos, we dedicate learning the schos of our precious hostages, Mechel Baruch Hashem, bring them home. B'shalom and b'karv in the merit of our holy soldiers, Mechel Baruch allow them to be successful. B'chol Masei Yedin. And we'll say with that, let's go. Baruch Hashem, a lot to do today, but we got this. We're going to make a run in Meretz Hashem for the Mishnah on Amud Beis. Today's daf is Daled 4. We are picking up on literally the top of Gimel Amud Aleph 3b. Let's go. Okay, says the Gemara. I'm Rabbi Yonasan. Actually, the Bach change, the Gilyon Ashas changes it to Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, second line down from the top. I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Horayos, ein chayav ashiyah kulon. If 100 is interesting, if 100, let's say you have a basin made up of 100 people, and they sat down to adjudicate a case. Halacha l'maisa, there's no obligation for par helam davar min hatzibur, unless, of course, all of them participated in the judgment. In other words, all of them have to go ahead and have weighed in on the judgment. Shnei marvim kol das bnei Yisrael yishku ad sheyishku kulon ad shetiv shot hara b'chol das Yisrael. So it's an interesting halacha. So in other words, the only time that a Beis Din is going to have to bring a par halam davar min hatzibur is when everyone in the Beis Din participated in the ruling. So if someone abstained, for example, ultimately, again, no par. Amrav, when we read Rav Hoshia, Hachanayim Mistabra, this seems to be abundantly clear as well. In general, we have the concept of rubo kakulo, that a majority ultimately is like the whole. The hachaksiv, but yet over here, what does it say? Kol ha'eda. The used lashon of kol ha'eda, which indicates to us, says Rabbi Yochanan, that the entire Beis Din must be participatory in this psak halacha, to have a par helam davar min hatzibur. Hoyo v'kach afilu hein mea. Okay, so the Gemara says Tanan. So that's what's saying. The Gemara now questions this from our Mishnah. So Tanan, horu Beis Din, the other echamei shetau, right? If Beis Din paskind and one of the members of the Beis Din knew that a mistake was made, Talmud V'ray Lahoros, or I will say again, there was a Talmud Chacham in the audience there in the galley who was fit for judgment, and he realized ultimately again that the ruling was mistaken. But despite that, Halach Va'asa Apihem, he went and he ate the chaylev, as we'll keep using that case, based on their ruling. So the Gemara says, Bein Sha'asu Va'asa Iman, Bein Sha'asu Va'asa Achareyan, Bein Shalo Asu Va'asa. So whether again he did it with the Beis Din, he did it after the Beis Din, they did it before the Beis Din, they didn't do it at all, he just did it. Halacha l'maisa, harei zechayiv mipnei shelo talab Beis Din. At the end of the day, this was the case in Mishnah. So the individual is chayiv. Why? Because since he knows better, therefore he cannot be counted as depending or acting based on the ruling of the Beis Din. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Hayhu dechayiv ha'achar pater. Now it's only this individual who's chayiv because he knew better, which indicates to us that if some other individual relied on the Beis Din, ultimately again he would be pater. But why? V'amai ha'lo nigmara hora. Obviously, this is a case where we're saying, Mishnah saying is one of the judges dissented, right? One of the judges ultimately again, one of the judges told the rest of the Beis Din, ultimately again, what you did is not correct. That psak is not correct. And I both say, now remember, halacha l'maisa, we just said before, Rabbi Yochanan said before, that in order for there to be liability, ultimately again, what has to happen? Halacha l'maisa, the entire Beis Din has to participate. But this is a case where one member of the Beis Din is not participating. What's the case? This is very interesting. What's the case? The dissenting judge, the one judge who said, hey, guys, you're all wrong, he went ahead and he nodded his head. Interesting. So in other words, by nodding his head, Rashi points out over here is, he indicated that he is participating in this. Even though he actually did not participate, he gives the impression of participation, and therefore it's considered to be as if everyone has participated in this ruling. Interesting. So Tashma, Horu Beis Din, the Achman Shatau, if Beis Din paskin and one of the members of the Beis Din realized that the Beis Din made a mistake, varmalan ton atem, and again that dayan, that judge says, Chevra, you're making a mistake. Hare elu pturim. Ultimately, the Beis Din is pater from par ha'elam davar minat tzibor, because you have to have everyone participating. Time of davar ton atem de pturim. So interestingly enough, the only reason they're pater is because he said to them, you're making a mistake. Hashasik mishtak chayavin. Ultimately, again, if he wouldn't have said anything, they'd be liable. I think v'gamar lahem hora v'amai ha lo horukulon. But once again, if Rabbi Yochanan, you're right, why should there be liability? Because Rabbi Yochanan said, in order for there to be liability, you need the participation of all the judges. But here, not all the judges are participating. Amri hachinami kiyon she'erchem barosho. What's the case over here? The case is where he's nodding his head. So the act of nodding his head, halacha l'maisa, is considered to be participation, even though he's disagreeing with the Beis Din. Interesting. So Maser Rabbi Sharshia, some Rabbi Sinadi, Rabbi Shem Gamliel, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Tzadok Shaya Omrim. So both say very interesting halacha over. Rabbi Sharshia says the rabbis relied on the teachings of Rabbi Shem Gamliel, on the teachings of Rabbi Lazar ben Tzadok, who said, "Ein gozrin gzera ala tzibor, ela imkein rov hatzibor yecholin la'amod ba." We'll say a very interesting halacha. You cannot go ahead and decrease something on the congregation unless, of course, we know with certainty that the majority of people have the ability to go ahead and uphold this halacha. Very interesting, right? You cannot legislate law that the majority of the populace cannot uphold. We just actually saw this in Avodah Zarah. If you remember again, this is why Chazal had to rescind the concept of pas palter, baker's bread. Right, bread made by a Gentile baker. Originally, again, the rabbis outlawed it, and then what happens? They realized that was impossible because you had communities where there was no Jewish baker, and therefore that created an undue hardship. They had to rescind it. So listen to this. Mikra, what's the pasuk that supports this idea? So the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Malachi, so literally again, with a curse you have cursed me, va'osi atem kovim hagoy kulo, and you are stealing from me the entire nation. The Gemara says, I v'ha'acha d'chsev hagoy kulo, v'rubo kikulo, yet here it says, Rabbi say, use lashon of kol, but kol never means everyone, kol means the rov, to which the Gemara says, you're right, tiyufta d'Rabbi Yochanan, tiyufta. In the end, we refute Rabbi Yochanan's position. So therefore, Rabbi say again, Rabbi Yochanan came along, and Rabbi Yochanan said that whenever you have a Beis Din and you have a par ha'elam davar minat tzibor, remember again, what's par ha'elam davar minat tzibor? That's ultimately, again, Beis Din paskins, delivers an erroneous psak, majority of the klal relies on it, there's a special carbon that's brought. Who brings that carbon, the par? Is it the Beis Din? Is it the populace? That's the machlokes. Okay, we'll get to that. Rabbi Yochanan posited that the only time there is liability for that is when the entire Beis Din participates in the psak halacha. Where does he get that from? Because lashon of the pasuk is im kol adas b'nei Yisrael. The Gemara just went ahead and disproved that and showed that that's not true. Sometimes you could find the word kol, and kol can mean what? Kol can mean majority. Kol can mean majority. So therefore, halacha l'maaseh, the Gemara is effectively disproven, Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore you do not need the entire participation of the entire Beis Din in order to go ahead and have a par ha'elam davar minat tzibor. Incredible. Ve'ela mai kol adas, so then what is the meaning of the expression kol adas? If it doesn't mean that you need 100% participation, what does it mean? So we'll say, watch this. What it means is, in order for there to be a par ha'elam davar minat tzibor, the entire Sanhedrin has to have been in attendance. All 71 judges have to be present. If someone was absent, someone was not there, you cannot have a par ha'elam davar minat tzibor situation. Incredible. Amar Rabbi Yoshua. Yud say a beautiful Gemara. Rabbi Yoshua says, 10 judges who are sitting together in judgment. Kolar taloi b'tzavar kulon. Literally, again, there's a beam or a yoke. There's a yoke on top of all of their necks. In other words, all of the judges carry a sense of collective responsibility for the psak of the Beis Din. So the Gemara says, Pshita, that's kind of obvious. Obviously, everyone on the Beis Din bears the responsibility for the decision that is going to be made. So what's the chiddush over here? Hakamash Mulan, tafidu talmid b'fnei rabo. Supposed to listen to this. It comes to include even a case of, let's say, a student who's on the same Beis Din with his Rebbe. Now, what does this mean? I might have thought like this. a student in front of his Rebbe is always going to be deferential. So therefore, maybe the student knows that the Rebbe is wrong, but he doesn't want to say anything. Kamash Malon, no, everyone on that basin has responsibility. So therefore, again, the student bears responsibility. You can't just be deferential. If you're on a basin, you have an obligation to seek out truth, even if it's to the contrary of your Rebbe. Rav Huna, it's very interesting, listen to this. Rav Huna, Rav Huna, when he would go out for judgment, sit in judgment, he would always take 10 students from the yeshiva with him. Why? The Gemara says, in order that they be able to take literally some of the splinters from the beam. In other words, what's happening over here is Rav Huna was saying, if I'm going to take responsibility for judgment, I want others to shoulder that responsibility together with me. Ravashi, when someone would bring him an animal to see if it was a treifa, let's say after passing on the animal as a kosher treif, what would he do? He essentially would assemble a beis din, or really a panel of experts. He would bring 10 butchers from Masa Machasya to look at this particular animal. Why? So that they should be able to handle literally, again, a splinter from the beam, so that there should be collective responsibility. So I will say it's interesting that from the Gemara it makes it sound like that they were afraid of assuming the entire responsibility for the judgment and kind of wanted to defray a little bit of responsibility upon others. It could also very well be able to say that we know that the way it works is you could accomplish so much more when you are part of a collective than when you do things individually. And it could very well be that what's happening over here is as follows. Judgment requires siyata d'shmaya. Judgment requires incredible divine providence, because after all, like the Gemara says, Ein l'dayin ladon ela ma she'ein avro. So a judge can only adjudicate that which he sees in front of him, which means that even when you're the judge, no matter how big of a Talmid Chacham you are, you never have complete information. So you need siyata d'shmaya. So it could very well be that what these Rabbanim are doing is they're assembling a group. I will say because there is always greater siyata d'shmaya. There is always greater divine providence when we do things together. When Jews act as a unit, when we act as a nation, when we act or as a group, as a cohesive group, that is a force multiplier. And what we could accomplish when we are together as a chevra, as a beis din, as a kehila, as a nation, is infinitely greater than what we could accomplish as individuals. So it could very well be that these Rabbanim are saying as individuals, there's a heightened probability perhaps of making a mistake in judgment, but bring in other Yidden, bring in other Jews, create a cohesive spiritual group, and ultimately, again, that will have siyata d'shmaya. Incredible. Mishnah, Horu beis din v'yadu shetau, v'chazru bahen, ben she'eviu kaparas and ben shelo eviu kaparas. And v'halav ha'asa piens. Well, it's an interesting case over here. Beis din made an erroneous ruling. So let's do same case, right? Same case. Beis din went ahead and paskined that chaylev is mutter. Okay, so they paskined incorrectly, and then what happened? They realized they made a mistake. They retracted their ruling. Okay, whether they brought the par helam davar minat tzibor or not, right? So whether they brought the carbon or not, what happened? Someone acted on their psak. So we'll say, you see, you've seen this case in the previous case. In the previous case, Beis din made a mistake in ruling. Beis din didn't realize it yet. Reuven went ahead and went out and ate chaylev. Okay, so the Mishnah said that halacha l'maisa, ultimately again, halacha l'maisa, the individual is freed from personal liability because he's covered by Beis din. This case is different. In this case, Beis din paskined erroneously. Beis din realized their mistake, but Reuven didn't hear about the fact that Beis din made a mistake. So what did Reuven do? Reuven went out and ate chaylev. He went out and ate chaylev. So what's the halacha? Rabbi Shimon says, Reuven is pater. Reuven is pater. Why? Because Reuven is acting based on the psak of the Beis din. Rabbi Lazar Omer, safek. Rabbi Lazar says it's a safek. Now, interestingly enough, now what does that mean? It's a safek. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Lazar says, we're not sure. Is this called that he's relying on Beis din or that he's relying on himself? So the Gemara says, Ezu safek, yashav lo b'soch beiso, chayiv. Halach lo l'medina sayam, pater. So we'll say, interestingly enough, Rabbi Lazar says like this. He also makes an interesting distinction between cases. If Reuven is home, then ultimately, again, he's chayiv. Why is that? Because if you're home, you should know about the hak, right? You should know about that. You should know about what's going on, and you should have heard about the fact that Beis Din reversed its ruling. If, on the other hand, ultimately, again, he's traveling, then again, he's out of the city, he should have, then again, it's understandable that he does not know that Beis Din reversed its psak. Rabbi Kiva says, Mo da'ani bazeh, Shukarov Lapata Minachova. Rabbi Kiva says, I happen to agree with this case that he's traveling. This case seems to me that it's closer to saying that he should be pater than liable. Amar ben Azai, but why should someone who's traveling be any different than someone who's in his home? Because again, the Gemara's Ben Azai says at the end of the day, so Rabbi Kiva responds, someone who's in his home ultimately has every reason to know information. Someone who's traveling doesn't necessarily have access to that same information. Horu Beis Din Lakras Kalagov. So we'll say that's case one. Case two. Beis Din paskind to uproot, and they made an erroneous psak, but in this case over here, the erroneous psak is to uproot an entire mitzvah. For example, Amru, Ein Nida Batorah, Ein Shabbos Batorah, Ein Avodas Kochavim Batorah. So we'll say, for example, they say, there's no such thing as Hilchos Nida. They make a dramatic mistake with an entire segment of the Torah. There's no Shabbos, no mitzvah of Shabbos. There's no prohibition of avodah zarah. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Harei p'turin. Now, what does that mean? Harei p'turin. So remember again, we're talking about now the liability for par helam davra minat sibor. So as essentially, what's going to say this outside, what we're going to see is par helam davra minat sibor occurs or is brought when a Beis Din made a mistake about a detail in a mitzvah. But when they make a mistake about an entire mitzvah, there's no, right, they paskin, we no longer have to observe Shabbos. We no longer have to observe Nida. We no longer have to worry about avodah zarah. Then that's a mistake about an entire section in the Torah. That's not par helam davar minat sibor. So Mar says, Horu levatal miktas l'kayim miksas harei elu chayavin. If they paskined and they upheld part of a mitzvah and negated part of a mitzvah, that's par helam davar minat sibor. Case that, for example, Amru yesh nida b'Torah v'hach aval abal shomer yom kineged yom pater. So they say there is such thing as hilchos nida, but if a man has relations with the shomer yom kineged yom, what is that? They will say, so that has to do with the biblical construct of nida, where if a woman would see blood during certain times of the month, she would have to observe one corresponding day of purity. So they say that halacha doesn't apply, right? Or Yesh Shabbos Batar Pater. Right, Pater. So for example, they say there is Shabbos, but you're allowed to carry something from a private domain to a public domain. So they're making a mistake about a detail. Yesh Avodas Kochavim Batar Val Mishtach Ave Pater. Right? There is, of course, an Isra Avodah Zarah, but you're allowed to bow down. You can't do anything else, but you're allowed to bow down. So ultimately, again, Hari Elu Chayovin. In these cases, you would be Chay Par Helam Davar Minat Sibor. Why? Shneemar V'ne'elam Davar. Davar V'lo Kol Haguf. Because the way the pasuk is structured is the pasuk says a certain detail was obscured by the Beis Din. It's when Beis Din makes a mistake about a detail that there is Par Helam Davar Minat Sibor. But if they make a mistake about the mitzvah in its entirety, then ultimately, again, there is no par helam dara minat sibor. Incredible. So we'll say, so let's analyze this point a little bit, both of these points. So two cases in the Mishnah. Amrav Yehuda, Amrav. My time is Rabbi Shimon. So we'll say, let's go back to the first case. Case number one in the Mishnah was, Beis Din paskins that chaylev is mutter. Right? Beis Din then realizes it's a mistake. They retract the psak. Ruvain did not hear about the retraction, and therefore Ruvain goes out to eat chaylev. What's Ruvain's status? Reb Shimon says, pater. Rabbi Lazar essentially says, really it depends. It's a suffix. I'm not sure. And then again, we get into a little bit about, was he at home? Was he traveling? So the Gemara says, my time with Reb Shimon. What's Reb Shimon's logic who says that he's pater? Ultimately, because Reb Shimon says, look, at the end of the day, why is Ruvain eating chaylev? Why is he eating chaylev? And what's the answer? Because he's relying on the psak of a Beis Din. That bottom line, that's the answer. So therefore, again, the fact that they retracted already, that's nice. But if you ask Ruvain, why are you picking up that piece of chaylev? He's going to tell you because of the psak of Beis Din. The alternate version of this, Amarav, Omer Hayr B'Shimon, Kol Horash Yatsa Berov Tzibor, Yachida Osa Pater, Lefi Shelo Nitna B'Hora El Lahafchin Ben Shogeg Umezin. In this other version, so Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rav, that any psak that went out for the majority of the tzibor, and a person and an individual acts on it, ultimately, again, he is pater. The Gemara says why? Because once again, he's acting based on the psak of a beis din. So Meisi Gemara is the kasha, parhalam davar shal tzibor, usiure ovalos kochavim, betchila govin alem divrei b'shemen. So we'll say this is very interesting. Let's leave aside about the Zohar for now, but let's say parhalam davar minat tzibor. So right, let's say again, simple case, based in paskin chelev is mutter. Majority of Klal Yisrael went ahead and listened to that. Fine. So we'll say, so now what? So now also we have to bring this par. So Rabbi Shimon says, we make a collection. We made a collection, right? We go ahead and we collect for that from Klal Yisrael. So I don't know, you make a GoFundMe page, right? And this is for the par helam davar minat tzibor, and Klal Yisrael goes in and contributes. That's Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, mitrumas halishka hin bar. No, you can take it from the temple coffers. Rabbi said, now watch this. Amai kevan de gabilahu havilehoda. And Rabbi said, if that's the case that you're collecting it from the general population, then what does that mean? Everyone's going to know about the par halam davar minat tzibor. If that's the case, then when Reuven goes ahead and eats the chalev, how could he claim he didn't know? They're already collecting from the general population for the carbon. So one possibility is, in this case, they made a stam collection. They're fundraising, right? They didn't say what they're fundraising for. Or he wasn't in the city at the time of the collection. Rav holds like the other Tana, the Sanya, Okay, so here there's reverse attribution, and it's Reb Shimon who says that we take it from the temple coffers. Therefore, it's quite possible there's no public awareness. Okay, incredible. So what's it sound? So remember, we're focusing now still on our first case in the Mishnah. Based in Paskin, that halacha l'maisa, the halacha l'maisa chelev is mutter. They then realize their mistake. They reverse their psak. Shimon did not hear about the reversal. So what happened? He eats chelev. Is he liable or not? Right? Different than our first case, because in the first Mishnah, Beis Din did not know about the erroneous kite of their ruling, and therefore, again, they're still promoting this psak. In this case, Beis Din realized it. So again, Reb Shimon says, Ruvain's pater, because he's still considered to be acting based on the guidance of the Beis Din, and then Rabbi Elazar really gets into this suffix. Let's analyze a bit more. Tanya, Rabbi Meir says, Rabbi Meir mechayev, Reb Shimon poter, Rabbi Meir says you're chayev, Reb Shimon says you're pater. Rabbi Elazar omer suffix. And Rabbi Elazar says it's a suffix, Mishum sumchas amar taloi. Sumcha says it's a little bit like suspended. We'll explain each of these. Rabbi Yochanan, Asham taloi ikavenayo. So we'll say what the difference over here is whether or not, again, the individual is liable to bring in Asham taloi. We're going to talk about this a little bit more. Asham taloi, we'll say, is brought in a situation, ultimately, again, where you are not sure, did you go ahead and commit an avera or not? That's what's called an Asham taloi. So the Gemara says as follows. Let's analyze a bit. So the Gemara says, top of Dalet. Dalet Medalef. Okay, good. We're making good ground over here. Dalet Medalef. V'lo mi boileman damar tzibor ma'isi mefarsim emelsa. Now, that goes without saying. Now, remember again, we keep reverting back to our original machlokes, or one of our earlier machlokesim. Who brings the par helam davar minat tzibor? Ultimately, again, is that the people? Is it the Beis Din? So according to the opinion that says that it's the tzibor, the mefarsim milsa, because then everyone knows about it. Allah filaman damar Beis Din mevin, the mefarsim milsa. Have a sha'al, hava amrilei. So I'll say, even according to the opinion that says that it's the Beis Din that brings it, so there's not as much of a piercing of publicity. Still, had Reuven asked, he would have found out. So I'll say, it's interesting, what you see over here at root of this machlokes is like how much liability or how much responsibility is there on Reuven to find out about the current state of affairs. I'm Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi bar Zvida. Marshal the Sumchas Lamadar Domer. To what could Sumchas's position be compared? La Adam Shevi Kaparosa Ben Hashmashos. So it's like an individual who brought his carbon Ben Hashmashos. Now, remember again, carbonos must be brought by day. Let's say brought by day. Let's say someone inadvertently brought their carbon Ben Hashmashos during the twilight period between day and night. Safik mi ba'ol yom. This Gemara says. So Safik mi ba'od yom. So Safik, I'm sorry, Ben Hashmashos, Safik mi ba'od yom, niskarpralo. Safik mishecha shecha, niskarpralo. She'ein mevi'in asham taloi. So ultimately, the Gemara says that would be an example of a case where we're not bringing asham taloi. V'lo mi ba'il leban da'amar, Beis Din mevi'in delo efarsim milsa. And again, it goes without saying, according to the opinion that says that it's Beis Din that brings the seir, because again, there's no publicity associated with that. But even according to the opinion that says that it's the tzibur that brings it, and therefore there would be publicity around this. Rav says, the hacha besafik mi ba'ol yom safik meshech hashecha ish sha'el lo ashkach inish de meshayle. Because we're both saying in this case over here, ultimately, again, there would be no one, so to speak, to ask for clarity. But yet that's different than the case by the Beis Din, where there is someone to ask for clarity. So back to the Mishnah. So remember again, so far, we have clarity on the position of Rabbi Shimon, right? Rabbi Shimon says that Beis Din paskin chelev is mutter, then Beis Din walks it back, right? Beis Din reverses. Ruvain didn't hear about the reversal, eats chelev. Rabbi Shimon says, you're pater. You're pater. Why? Because you are considered to be acting on based on the psak of the Beis Din, and therefore you are covered by that. Now remember again, Rabbi Lazar just follow the progression. Rabbi Lazar says safek, and then the Mishnah introduces the idea, the difference between maybe if he's home versus if he's traveling. Rabbi Akiva said, I hear that, right? I hear that, and I hear Rabbi Akiva says, I think that the one who's traveling ultimately again, really, I'm leaning to saying that he's pater much more than saying that he's chayiv. Ben Azai says Rebbe. Remember, Ben Azai is Rabbi Akiva's Talmud. So Ben Azai says Rebbe. What's the difference between someone who's traveling and someone who's home? To which Rabbi Akiva responds, very simple. Someone who's home should know what's going on. Someone who's traveling doesn't have access to information. So Shapir, come with Rabbi Akiva, the Ben Azai. Rabbi Akiva says, good, back to Ben Azai. Listen to this, Rabbi Sai. The nafkamina case would be, let's say Ruvain ultimately again begins to travel. He left his house, but he's still in the city. Still in the city. So Rabbi Sai, so what would you do in that case over here? The Ben Azai chayiv, the Hababei say, you say, according to Ben Azai, he should be chayiv. Why? Because he's still home. He's still home. Ultimately, the Rabbi Akiva pater, the high hichsik baderech. Ultimately, again, he's going to be pater. Why? Because again, once you leave your house, you don't have the same access to information. Incredible. Horlo bezin lakar as kolaguf. So we'll say, so now we come to the last part of the Mishnah, which is going to be the bulk of our conversation now. So we'll say, so first of all, how do we paskin? The Rambam ultimately paskin is like Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, namely, that halacha l'maisa, bezin paskin that chelev is mutter, right? Then bezin reverse, that's psak. After the reversal, Ruvain eats chelev. What's Ruvain's liability? So we accept this distinction. If Ruvain is home, then ultimately again Ruvain is chayiv. Why? Because if you're home, you should know what's going on, and you should know about the reversal. If Ruvain was traveling, then halacha l'maisa again, even if he just left his house, ultimately he's going to be pater. Why? Because once you leave your house, you don't have the same access to information, and he is considered to be acting based on the psak of the Beis Din, and therefore is absolved from personal liability. Incredible. Next, remember what did the Mishnah say? If Beis Din makes an erroneous psak and they uproot an entire section of the Torah, there's no such thing as Shabbos. That's not par halam davar min hatzibur. What's par halam davar min hatzibur? Where they make a mistake about a detail regarding a mitzvah. So says the Gemara, Tanabanan, v'ne'elam davar v'lo sheyakar ha-mitzvah kula. Again, when is there par halam davar min hatzibur? When Beis Din makes a mistake regarding a detailed davar, but not regarding an entire mitzvah. So what's an example of this? Amru eini da b'Torah, ein Shabbos b'Torah, ein avodas kochavim b'Torah. They say there's no nida, there's no Shabbos, there's no avodah zara. Yachlu yu chayavin. You would have thought that maybe they're liable to par halam davar min hatzibur. Talmud lomar v'ne'elam davar v'lo shetis alim mitzvah kula. Again, that's talacha. Aval Amru, listen to this. Yesh nida b'Torah aval haba shomer som keneged yom pater. So, for example, if they make a mistake, so they say, of course, it's sochos nida, but if you have relations with a woman who's observing one clean day corresponding to a day that she saw bleeding, such a person is pater, right? That's called par halam davar min hatzibur. They're making a mistake in a detail of sochos nida. Yesh Shabbos b'Torah aval amotzim rabim pater. There is sochos Shabbos, but they paskin that carrying something from a Rishus HaYachav to Rishus HaRabim is pater. So they're making a mistake with a detail. Ultimately, again, par halam davar min hatzibur. Yachlu yu p'turin. You would have thought that Beis Din should be pater in these cases. I'm sorry. Yesh avodas kochavim. Aval mishtachave pater. Same thing. There is avodah zara. but to make a mistake about a detail regarding avodah zara. So again, halacha l'maisa yachol yupturin tamulomar v'ne'elam davar v'lo kol haguf. So we'll say this is it. For par helam davar minat tzibor, Beis Din is only chayiv if they make a mistake regarding a detail of a mitzvah. But if they seek to uproot the mitzvah in its entirety, again, we'll say it sounds strange, we say pater. Pater means they're pater from par helam davar minat tzibor. Certainly not a good Beis Din. Amar yachol yupturin ve'bikiyah mitzvahs ubiktal mitzvahs pturin ubakiras kol haguf pturin. So Gemara says like this: you would have thought ultimately again they are pater. Now, if you're going to say ultimately again when they uphold part and they want to be mevatel part, they're pater. And if you go ahead and if they uproot everything, you're pater. Then when is there ever liability? Tana hachi kakashle. This is what the Tana was bothered by. Ema davar kula milsa mashma. Maybe not. Maybe v'ne'elam davar. How do you know that davar only means a detail? Maybe davar means an entire mitzvah. So the Gemara says tambalamar v'ne'elam davar. So Gemara says, okay, my mashma, I don't understand. How do you see from the phrase v'ne'elam davar that there's only liability if they uproot the detail, but not the mitzvah in its entirety? Amra'ula karibe v'ne'elam mi davar. So the way we actually understand the v'ne'elam davar is v'ne'elam mi davar. Their eyes were blinded to a detail. The Gemara says, Chizkiya Amarkra va'asu achos mikol mitzvos. Mikol mitzvos v'lo kol mitzvahs. So again, the lashon on the pasuk is, and they did something mikol mitzvos. Mikol mitzvos means like a detail from the mitzvah and not the mitzvah in its entirety. Rabbi Shmuel Yalif davar mi zakin mamre. Make a gzir shava from zakin mamre. Again, remember who's zakin mamre? The rebellious sage. That's the guy, the member of the Beis Din, who will not go ahead and give in to the majority. Dichsibe b'zakin mamre ki pali mimcha davar. Small. Ma mamre min hadavar v'lo kol davar. Af bahora davar v'lo kol agov. Just like zakin mamre, he's arguing on a detail. So to param davar minat tzibor, davar means a detail. Amar Rabbi Shmuel. Eid Beis Din chayavin. So again, it's just what I want to point out. All that was happening just there is that there are differences of opinion as to where to learn this out from. But the good news is everyone is agreeing with the halacha, namely that halacha l'maisa is only par helam davar minat tzibor when Beis Din makes a mistake about a detail of a mitzvah. But if they make a mistake and they want to uproot the mitzvah in its entirety, ultimately, again, there's no par minat tzibor. I'm Rabbi Shmuel. Ein Beis Din chayav, very interesting. Achiyoru b'davar she'enat tzdukin modin bo. So we'll say, listen to this. There's only par helam davar minat tzibor when Beis Din makes a mistake regarding something that the tzedukim argue on. Okay, we'll see what this is. But if they make a mistake regarding something that the tzedukin agree with, pturin, ultimately they're pater. Nabosai, remember again, what do the tzedukim agree with? Right? What do they agree with? Tar shebechsav, anything that's explicit. What do they disagree with? Tar shebal peh. So what the Gemara is saying is like this. There's only par helam davar minat tzibor in a situation, ultimately again, where Beis Din makes a mistake regarding something that's not explicit. But if they make a mistake regarding something that is explicit, ultimately, there's no par helam davar minat tzibor. Why not? My timer, zil kari bei rav. Pay attention in class. Pay attention in class, which means again, if Beis Din makes a mistake in something that is explicit in the Torah, they'll say that's negligence. That's negligence. Par helam davar minat tzibor, Abosai, is where you begin to see what's happening over here. It's where Beis Din makes a mistake in a detail in a mitzvah that's not explicit. It's not explicit. Okay, mistakes happen, but you make a mistake in something explicit, or even the tzedukim know this, that's professional negligence. And with this professional negligence, that's not par helam davar minat tzibor. Incredible. So the Gemara says, 1 second, let's analyze this. Tanan. You should say, so 1 second, because the examples that the Mishnah gave seem to be examples that are explicit in the Torah. So Tanan, first part line about the bottom. Yesh nida b'Torah aval aval shomer yom keneged yom pater va'amai shomer yom keneged yom ksiv v'safra la melamed shesoferes echad li echad. So we'll say, listen to this. But the halacha of shomer yom keneged yom, that when a woman bleeds on one day during certain days of the month, that she observes one corresponding day of Tara, of purity, that's actually explicitly written in the Torah. So shouldn't that be so again, you just said before that if anything is explicit, you don't bring par helam davar minat tzibor. To which the Gemara says, no, maybe the mistake they made was, Da'amri ha'ara sharia gmar biyahu dasira. they said that maybe initiating bia with this woman is mutter. It's only completing bia that's aser. And that makes it. It also says the pasuk esmikara ha'era. So ultimately, it says the man exposes her nakedness, which means even initial bia without completing the act is still going to be aser. So what's their mistake? Da'amri kedarka asira shelo kedarka sharia. They said, it's only bia kedarka. It's only bia kedarka that's aser. Bia shelo kedarka ultimately is going to be mutter. That's their mistake. The Gemara says it doesn't make sense. Haksiv mishkevei isha da'amri kedarka asir. I'm sorry, the mishkevei isha. I will say, interestingly enough, when the Torah refers to relations, it uses mishkevei. Mishkevei is plural. It's plural, which means that there are two halachically recognized acts of bia that are both legitimate acts of bia kedarka, bia shelo kedarka. So to make a distinction between those two, ultimately again, what is making a mistake in an explicit halach in the Torah? To which the Gemara says, Da'amri kedarka aser afilahara. So what they're saying is like this: if it's bia kedarka, even initial bia is going to be aser. Shelo kedarka gemar bihuda aser valahara sharia. If it's shelo kedarka, then ultimately it's only completing the act that's aser, but initiation of the act ultimately again is going to be mutter. All right, ihachi afilu nida nami. So you can make that same mistake with general hilchos nida. Not just Safaris Yom Kineged Yom Elali Olam Kidarka. Rather, in reality, they're making a mistake as follows. So the Amri Ha'ara Be'isha Davahu Dichsiv. Ultimately, and rather, the mistake is about Ha'ara, is initiating Bia, and their thought was this only applies to maybe a bona fide Nida, but not Shemar Yom Kineged Yom. So we're just trying to show how the case of Nida in the Mishnah is a mistake about a particular detail that is not explicit. The mistake they make is that a woman could only become a zava during the day. Where do they get it? From the chsiv, kol yemei zova. Okay, so that's a good example. So they made a mistake. A woman could only become a zava during the day because it says kol yemei zova. That's a mistake. A woman could become a zava whenever she has a zivus flow, whether it's by day or by night. Good. Next. So we're just trying to show each of these cases the Beis Din's make a mistake in a detail. The Gemara, and I should say, in a non-explicit detail. So Gemara says, "Tnan yesh Shabbos b'Torah v'alamotzi rishus pater." So the Mishnah's example was, Beis Din says there is Shabbos, but you're allowed to carry an item from one domain to another. The Gemara says, what? V'amai hotza uksiva. Hotza, the prohibition to transport an item from one domain to another domain in Shabbos, is explicit. Because the Gemara says, "Lo sotziu masa mibatechem." So it's an explicit pasuk. So how could we say that there's par halam government at zero liability for this? The Amri hotzahu da asar hachnasa mutar. It's interesting. They say ultimately again hotzah, which means from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah is going to be asar, but achnasa, the reverse of that is mutar. V'bay sema. The Amri hotzav achnasa uda asira moshit v'zorek shari. Or they say, for example, transporting an item is asar, but handing something or throwing something is mutter. So again, an example of where they're making a mistake in a detail. Tnan. So the case in the Mishnah was, Beis Din says, Avodah Zara is asr, but bowing down is mutter. 1 second. V'amai, hamishtachava haksiva dichsiv, lo tishtachave le'el acher. It's an explicit pasuk. Don't bow down to another god. The Amri, ki asira hishtachavia kidarka, avalo shelo kidarka sharia. They say ultimately, when is bowing down asr? When that's the normal way to worship the idol. But if you bow down to an idol that's not the normal way to worship it, it's mutter. So Rashi gives the example. What's the good example? This is Baal Pa'ar. How do you go out and you worship Baal Pa'ar? Right, it's an all-time crowd favorite. Right, you defecate on the idol. Right, so Lamaisa again. Let's say you bow down to Baal Pa'ar. I would have thought that Allah Lamaisa, you're potter. Gemara says that's the mistake they make. Because remember, we've seen this back in Avodah Zarah. Certain forms of worship are usher for all forms of idolatry. Bowing, right, prostrating yourself is one of those. The Gemara says, this pay pishudaim raglayim. Sharia. Or the other mistake they make was maybe only full prostrational bowing is usher. Right, but ultimately, again, non-full prostrational bowing is not asr, which is a mistake. So that'd be an example of Param Tav Ben Asira. So I'll say, so bottom line, the Gemara is accepting this idea from the Mishnah that the only time that there is Par Halam Dav Ben Atzibur is when Beis Din makes a mistake regarding a detail in a mitzvah. What kind of detail? A detail that the Tzedukim would not agree to, i.e., it's not explicit. But if they make a mistake regarding an explicit detail, or they try to uproot a mitzvah in its entirety, ultimately, no par helam davar minat tzibor. Incredible. Abosai, Dalet Amud Beis. But Rav Yosef, in Charisha b'Shabbos Ma'u. So what about the following? We got this. What about the following? Let's say Beis Din Paskins. There is no malacha of Choresh. The malacha of Choresh is plowing on Shabbos. So they say there's no malacha of Choresh on Shabbos. Ma'u. What is the halacha in this situation? Mi amrina given the kamod b'kula milsa bebitel mixas v'kiu mixas dami. On one hand, we could say like this: they agree that there's 39 malachas, or at least that there are 38 malachas, right? But they're just disagreeing on this detail. So this is called paskening on a detail in a mitzvah. So therefore, it should be subject to param dav benat tzibor. Oh Dilma, given the ka'akaryon lecharisha kol ikar ka'kiras guf dami. Someone said, listen to this, or what they're doing with this psak is they're uprooting an entire malacha. So maybe uprooting an entire malacha is called uprooting an entire mitzvah, and therefore there's no paralam dav minat tzibur liability. Well, see, it's interesting, Shaila. So on one hand, they're agreeing that there's Shabbos and that there's malacha. They're just disagreeing on one detail, i.e. one malacha. On the other hand, you could say no, they're going ahead and halacha l'maisa. They're going in halacha l'maisa, uprooting an entire malacha. Maybe that's called uprooting an entire mitzvah, and therefore no par helam davar minat tzibor. So let's analyze. So Tashma yesh nida b'tarav alav shomer som kineged yom pater. Again, going back to the Mishnah's case, there is hilchos. Basically, said there is hilchos nida, but if you have relations with the shomer som kineged yom, ultimately you're pater. Va'amai ha karyon l'shomer yom kineged yom kol ikar. But they're uprooting this entire detail. As Rabbi said, the Mishnah said when Beis Din uproots an entire mitzvah, there's no par helam davar minat tzibor. We're trying to figure out over here is what happens when they're uprooting not an entire mitzvah, but an entire detail that is part of a bigger mitzvah. So in the Shomer Yom Kineged, they're uprooting this entire halach. Amar l'cha Rav Yosef, Shomer Yom Kamina Kideshin. No, because also remember again, as we saw before, they were making a mistake regarding a detail about Shomer Yom Kineged Yom, not saying that Shomer Yom Kineged Yom is mutter. Tashma, Yesh Shabbos b'Torah, aval hamotzi mirshus Surabim pater. Remember again, Beis Din Paskin, there is Shabbos, but you're allowed to carry something from Rishus Harabim to Rishus or Rishus to Surabim. V'amai ha'karyon lahotza kol ikar. They're going ahead and they're uprooting the concept of hotza. To which the Gemara says, no. Hasam nami kiddush. We answered this already. What were they making a mistake? They were saying you're allowed to throw something or allowed to hand something. They're making a mistake regarding a detail. Tashma. Yesha, well, let's go. Right? There is avodah zarah, but if you bow down your potter, va'amai ha'akaryon l'ishtacha ve'kol. They're uprooting the concept of prostration. So we'll say once again, no. We answered that. They're making a mistake regarding a detail, a prostrational detail. They're making a mistake about. So Rav Yosef, ultimately, the Gemara doesn't answer it, right? So now Rav Yosef's kasha is a very interesting idea, which is here. So Beis Din Paskin, there is no malacha of plowing on Shabbos. So what is that? Do we say they're making a mistake regarding a detail of Hilchos Shabbos, right? And therefore, again, there's parahelam davar minat tzibor, or no? They're uprooting an entire malacha. So therefore, that looks like the uprooting of an entire mitzvah, and therefore, no par ha'elam davar minat tzibor. So both say, the Gemara raises one more kasha, and then we'll answer this. So the Gemara says, By Reb Zera, ain't Shabbos b'shviyas maho. This is very interesting. Let's say Beis Din Paskins, Shabbos doesn't apply during the Shemitah year. That's how they paskin. Shabbos doesn't apply during the Shemitah year. So first of all, we'll see why they would say that. So the Gemara says, "B'maitao b'hadin krad." Now, what would lead them to this? What will lead them to this is a mistake regarding the following pasuk: "B'charish ubakatzer tishbos." So the pasuk says literally again, "Charish" means plowing, "katzer" means harvesting. You shall rest. Bizman dika charisha ika Shabbos. So they paskin like this: when there's plowing, there's Shabbos. And ultimately, when there's no plowing, there's no Shabbos. When is there no plowing? Shemitah. So ultimately, again, so that was their mistake. So Beis Din Paskin, there's no Shabbos during the Shemitah year. So So do we see like this? That on one hand, look, as much as they're being mevatel Shabbos during the Shemitah year, but they're upholding Shabbos when? during the other 6 years. So therefore, this is called a mistake regarding a detail, not uprooting a mitzvah. On the other hand, uprooting Shabbos for an entire year maybe is called making a mistake regarding a mitzvah in its entirety, and therefore no parallel of minatzibah. Ravina Tashma Navi Shinisnava Lakar Davamit Tivrei Torah Chayiv the Bittel Mikzas or the Kiyah Mikzas. Suppose to listen to this. The Gemara brings another case. If you have a false prophet, right, and the Navi comes along and he prophesizes to uproot a mitzvah, right? The Navi comes along and he says, "I've prophesied, I've heard the word of God, and there's no longer a prohibition on idolatry." Okay, so that's a capital offense, death penalty. Death penalty. Ultimately, again, listen to this. Lebittel Mikzas or Lekiyah Mikzas. What happens if he comes along ultimately again and he upholds part of the mitzvah and he negates part of the mitzvah? Rabbi Shimon Omer Pater. Rabbi Shimon says that he's Pater. When it comes to idolatry, even if he says today, right, Fridays you're allowed to worship idolatry, but the rest of the week you can't. Ultimately, again, he's going to be liable. We'll say, what do you see from here? Shemamina, Ein Shabbos B'Shvius, Kibitl Mixas or Kiyah Mixas Tamishmaminas. We'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, when you play around or when there's a mistake regarding a detail, that is, or a particular part of a mitzvah, even if that part represents something substantial, that is still called a mistake in a detail and not an attempt ultimately again to uproot the Torah in its entirety. So therefore I will say, working backwards, halacha l'maisa, ultimately again, what we see is as follows. Therefore, the case over here of where a person says, the Beis Din says there's no Shabbos and Shemitah, that's considered to be a mistake in a detail. By extension, Rav Yosef's case, Beis Din makes an erroneous psak and they say, halacha l'maisa again, there's no malach of choresh, no malach of plowing. That is considered to be a mistake in a detail of a mitzvah, not an uprooting of a mitzvah, and therefore there is par helam davar min hatzibar. So therefore, if you bring this all together, it turns out the following. Halacha l'maisa. When is there par helam davar min hatzibar? Ultimately, again, only when Beis Din makes a mistake in something that is not explicit. If it's explicit, as evidenced by the fact that even the tzaddukim agree with it, no par helam davar min hatzibar. Right? Furthermore, there's only liability when they seek to uproot a detail. But ultimately, again, if they seek to uproot, or not seek to uproot, if they make a mistake regarding the observance of a mitzvah in its totality, no par helam davar min hatzibur. And these cases where, again, the Beis Din is making a mistake regarding a unit of a mitzvah, even though it's a significant unit, as long as the mitzvah bigadol remains intact, they will be liable to par helam davar min hatzibur. Haru Beis Din v'yad achman shato. Beis Din made a mistake, and one of the members of the Beis Din realizes the mistake. Va'amar lahem to'anatem. I must say, see, by the way, this is very exciting because you don't always see it like this. The dramatic, or I should say, the progression in the Mishnayos is dramatic, right? Mishnah 1, Beis Din made a mistake. No one knows about the mistake. The individual acts. Mishnah 2, Beis Din makes a mistake. Beis Din realizes the mistake. They reverse, but ultimately Ruvain didn't know. Mishnah 3, Beis Din makes a mistake. V'yada echad mehen shato. And one of the members of the Beis Din themselves now realizes, Chevra, this is a mistake. And during the Psak, V'amar lahem, to'anatem. You guys are wrong. O shelo haya mufla shal Beis Din sham, or for that matter again, Beis Din paskin, and the ranking, the Av Beis Din, the head of the court, wasn't there. Wasn't present. O shahaya echa mehem ger, o mamzer, o nesin, o zaken. Or there was a member of the Beis Din who was a convert, a mamzer, a nesin. The nesinim also were converts, or zakin, or is old. Now both say we're going to shelo hayurai lebanim. He was so old that he couldn't father children. Now both say we're going to talk about this, but all of these individuals are not allowed to serve on a Sanhedrin. Right? These are disqualifications. You cannot serve on a Sanhedrin if you're a ger, if you're a mamzer, if you're in a sin, or you're so old that you can't have kids. So again, I will say essentially there was a disqualified member of the Beis Din. What's the halacha? Harei pater. So essentially, if the Beis Din rendered the psak, so there's two cases over here, right? Ultimately, again, in case number 1, Beis Din rendered the psak, but before even the psak was formalized, or it was formalized, and one of the members said, you're wrong. So there's already an awareness about the erroneousness of the psak from the beginning. Ultimately, again, in that case, or for that matter, again, halacha l'maisa, there's a disqualified member of the Beis Din, in these cases, Beis will not bring a par helam davar min hatzibur. Shneimar kan eda v'neimar lahalan eda. It says over here eda, and it says over there eda ma eda mur la'alon kulan ru'in la'ra. Just like eda, ultimately, again, this is in the case of capital cases. Just like Eda over there refers to a unit, a body that is fit for adjudication of cases. Af Eda Amurakan Achikulan Ruyin Laura. So to over here, by Paralam Davminat Sibor, the only time you bring a Paralam Davminat Sibor is when everyone on the basin is fit for to be a basin. Says the Gemara, O Shalo Haya Mufla Shal Basin Shaminala. So we'll say it's interesting. So if the basin issued the psak, and the ranking member of the basin was not there, the psak ultimately, again, there's no param davar min hatzibor. So the Gemara says, why not? So where do you know that from? Amar Rav Sheshes, v'chein tanan Rabbi Shmuel, b'pnei ma amru horu b'davar shatzlukin modin bo p'turin. Why is that? We said before that if basin made a mistake regarding an explicit detail, so explicit that even the Sedukim agree with it, why are they pater? B'pnei shahaya lahem lilmod v'lo lamdu. Because they should have known. They should have had the knowledge, and they did not do so. Same thing. How do you adjudicate a case without the ranking sage? Adjudicating the case without the ranking sage is like not paying attention in school. Obviously, you have a ranking sage. Why do you have him? Because he's the smartest guy in the group. Don't think you are the smartest guy in the room. Right? There's usually someone smarter. So ultimately over here, there's an Av Beis Din. How do you go ahead and pass him without him? So sitting in session without the Av Beis Din is the same thing as making a mistake in an explicit halacha. Both of them represent professional negligence, and where there is professional negligence, there is not par helam davar min hatzibor. Ne'emar sham eda v'ne'emar kan eda shekulan ru'in lahora. So it says more of a hasa. All right, boss, I know what, we're not going to rush. We'll stop over here for today, boss. Everyone. All right, I don't know that the quality was the best, but sometimes it's just about getting where you need to go, even if the trip is a little sloppy. Again, we made it. Okay, next week, and now we both, so you can see the pages ahead are a little bit, the print gets bigger. Tremendous. Everyone. And good Shabbos. Chevron Zoom. Good Shabbos, everyone. Good Shabbos. Thank you, Greg. Thank you. Good Shabbos, everyone.